Welcome, everyone. My name is Ross Upshur. I'm a professor at the Department of Family and Community Medicine and the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And it's my great pleasure to be the moderator today on an exceptionally timely panel entitled Effective COVID Vaccines, Ethical Implications for Vaccine Research in 2021. This seminar is an initiative of the Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Ethics Network, and this is the final seminar of the 2020 year. Now, I'm delighted to invite three very distinguished panelists to discuss the topics. Firstly, we have Joe Millam, who's a bioethicist with the Clinical Center and the Department of Bioethics and Fogarty International Center at the US National Institute of Health. We're also joined by Dorcas Kamuya, who's a social scientist and head of the Health System and Research Ethics at the Kemri Wellcome Trust Research Program in Kenya, and Beatrice Tomé, who's from the Federal University of Sao Paulo, where she's an expert in preventive medicine. So the format for today, we want to encourage you to use the chat line to greet each other and say hello. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom interface. And please like questions that you see there, because that will bring them up on the priority list. So without further ado, we'll get started. I'm going to turn over to Beatrice Tomé, who's going to kick us off. Then we'll hear from Joe Millam, and then finally Dorcas Kamuya. Then we'll open up for discussion and take your questions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to this seminar. Beatrice?
Thanks, Ross, for these warm welcomes, and thanks for the organizing committee of this panel. I'm really, really excited to join the discussion. And hello, everyone. So what I'd like to do today, let me see if I can share my screen here. I have a few slides. Just to get us started, just let me know if you can see it. Just give a very, very brief overview of where we are in terms of COVID vaccine development, and just to try to bring to you guys' attention the issues behind the clinical development plans that we are witnessing, and why it's so important to have this discussion today on moving forward with vaccine research in the new year. So just I wanted to really get started to say, from a clinical development perspective, what we're witnessing is really a paradigm shift in clinical development pace. And we're really seeing everything much, much, much faster. And this is no news for everyone. We had experienced some of this with the Ebola vaccine trials during the epidemic in Africa. But I just wanted to, this is just a graphic from a publication from May, really, when we were just really starting these vaccines first in human trials. And so on the top here, what you can see is what we have as a regular, traditional clinical development plan, and spread across years, right? So the idea here is really to expose first humans after we have a lot of knowledge, at least some proof of concept of that a vaccine works, and some safety safeguards that we can try these vaccines in humans, right? And then the idea is that we expose more and more people in a sequential way up to when we get to the phases that we're going to try for efficacy. So the first, so just have in mind that the first goals of any vaccine development plans are really to ascertain safety, then to have some idea if this vaccine works, which we do by immune response, and then we expose a large number of people in order to see if it works in terms of protecting them from infection or from disease, depending on the outcomes that you wish to see. So of course, what you see here below is this clinical development plan really shortened up, and what can we what can we think about it when we see such a shortened period, everything that needs to happen in a long time frame that takes 10, 20, even 30 years in such a short window. When we started this race, we said, oh, we need a vaccine in the next 12, 18 months. And so how do we do it? So some enablers, of course, there's the pandemic pressure. There's been a lot of investment, unprecedented investment in COVID research, and including in the vaccine. Of course, we had previous knowledge that we gathered through MERS and SARS outbreaks that we could carry on now in order to develop COVID vaccines. And we are now, what we're really doing is overlapping clinical phases. So we have, this is why we have phase 1-2 trials in which we are starting for safety, but also having an eye on immunogenicity. The same, we're having phase 2, phase 3 trials in which we have a cohort, we're looking at safety, immunogenicity, but we're also at the same time having an eye on efficacy. So we're doing pretty much everything at the same time. And some challenges, of course, we can already think that people will be scared. I mean, we're doing, if this, and this got into public knowledge already, we're really shorten all these phases time periods. So we understand that we're exposing less people to these new drugs. So we are concerned about it, and we're still moving forward. Even the efficacy data that we do have, we know it's preliminary. It's oftentimes not representative of all the target groups, because we don't have all this efficacy or even safety data for all the groups that we'll later need to expose. We're having short follow-up periods, of course, because of the speed that everything is happening. And then on top of the limitations that we are imposed because we're having such shortened times for clinical development, we have to deal and keep this thought as we discuss further in this webinar, that we have limitations that are inherent to clinical trials, in particular to what comes to safety. So even if we go with the traditional way that and then we do get to test thousands of people with a new drug, with a new vaccine, we still don't get the chance to have the occurrence of more rare effects that we'll see only when we deploy in really large scale. So already for us to think about safeguards that will need to be put in place, regardless, even doing a regular development plan, but even more so if we're going with this pandemic pace. So here is just a snapshot of the COVID vaccine pipeline. According to WHO, we have 52 vaccines in clinical studies. That means being tested in humans, out of which 13 are in phase 3 trials, which is the more advanced phase prior to licensure, which tests for efficacy, while still looking, of course, at safety and immunogenicity. So here we have this is actually from the New York Times vaccine tracker. It's actually very user-friendly. I recommend for the more curious ones to have a look. They have really updated and user and friendly written summaries about all these vaccines. We are testing new platform vaccines. So actually, this is one of the challenges that are imposed to us now. For example, the DNA, the RNA vaccines, of which both Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines have a shared platform. The RNA vaccine is a platform of which we don't have any licensed vaccines so far. So of course this poses an extra challenge for us as we accompany how these vaccines will do later over time. So here are just a few what we know about these vaccines already. So the Pfizer vaccine has published results, in fact, peer-reviewed, and showing 95% efficacy. And the Pfizer vaccine has gained the news because it's been approved for emergency use in a couple of countries, including the US, Canada, and many others, Mexico, and this list is increasing. An emergency use is for someone that is not necessarily familiar. So it's it's a regulatory mechanism for use of a yet not licensed product in light of an emergency and for a very limited use, for example, for high priority, high risk groups, and this is what we're witnessing in the news these days. Moderna is another vaccine that really ranks high up in terms of the best succeeding vaccines. Yet we have not seen a peer-reviewed publication. The results that we have we gain through press release, really, but showing high efficacy, close to 95% as well, and it's currently under FDA review also for emergency use. Other candidates, we have the Russian Sputnik 5 vaccine produced by the Gamaleya Institute, and this was probably one of the first, if not the first, vaccine to be deployed in larger scale, even prior to licensure. So it's been deployed currently in Russia and other countries as well. We have the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, who's also recently published their results, and they're showing efficacy results that they're saying of 70% overall efficacy, but ranging from 62 to 90%. Here, there was an issue about this 90% being achieved in a subgroup of the participants that received a smaller amount of the antigen. So they've reported on that. So just to give you a very general overview, and why is this relevant for this discussion today? Because we are seeing that differently from 6 months ago, when we had no vaccine available, we are now having to deal with the fact that yes, some vaccines are proving to, even if only preliminary data is available, we have efficacious vaccines that now pose an ethical challenge in terms of how we design clinical trials moving forward. And just to finalize these initial remarks, if we want to discuss research moving forward and the possibility of controlling trials with placebo or with other vaccines, we need to discuss access, right? So this is these are graphs from a dashboard by the Duke University on commitments done by country in terms of accessing, purchasing vaccines. So this is just a rank of number of doses of vaccines by countries. So of course, the US, the European Union, they come really first because of their high purchasing power. And we have COVAX here. Let me just point this out to you as the mechanism for equitable access for low and middle income countries mostly. So here ranking quite good, but when I prefer this second visualization of the same data, which is when we look at number of doses acquired by a given country, looking at here on the horizontal axis, COVID burden, cases by million inhabitants, and here the estimated coverage. So if we take a country like Brazil, and I'm talking about Brazil just because it's my home country, so a high COVID burden of disease, and when we look at the estimated coverage, we really rank low, around 30% of our population to be covered, just to give an idea. And we have Canada, for instance, having around 5 doses secured per inhabitant. So again, just keep this, and this is no surprise, but just to keep this in mind as we discuss for the ethical implications of having trials moving forward. I guess that'll be that. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Beatrice. Nicely laid out the issues in terms of development. Joe, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here, and thanks to Dr. Tomei for a really great introduction there to where we stand in terms of vaccine development. And the focus of the discussion today is going to be on the ethical obligations that apply to vaccine studies that are ongoing against this background of there being so many vaccines that are either getting emergency use approval or are entering phase 3 trials. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to sketch really quickly some of the key ethical considerations that are relevant to evaluating placebo-controlled trials of experimental vaccines in this context where we already have some vaccines that appear to be safe and effective. And so for right now, I'm going to bracket questions about these different categories of approval, right? Emergency use versus full licensure and so on. We can come back to those. And I want to focus on the big picture question, which is, if we have a research team designing a trial, and as we have now, there are vaccines for which there's substantial evidence of safety and efficacy, right? So like, for example, the current Pfizer vaccine. The question that was posed, which is, would it be unethical then for a vaccine trial of another experimental vaccine candidate to use a placebo control? So if we are testing in phase 3 another experimental vaccine candidate, would it be unethical for that vaccine to be tested against placebo rather than against an active control, such as against the current Pfizer vaccine? And I can argue that the answer is not yes always, and it's not no, it's always fine. In fact, I'm going to argue what we should do is reframe the question. We should ask, under what conditions would it be ethical for a vaccine trial of another experimental vaccine to use a placebo control? So let me say why the answer is not yes, it's always unethical, or no, it's always fine, by stating the views that would give those sorts of absolute verdicts and saying something about what's wrong with them. So at one extreme, we have the view that once we have evidence that some intervention works, that intervention has to be used as a control whenever another experimental intervention is being tested for the condition that we're interested in. Okay, so as soon as we have evidence that one vaccine is safe and effective, we should drop placebo-controlled trials of all other vaccines, and we should give participants in all trials the best preventive care available. So that's one extreme. Then the other extreme is the view that it's always permissible to conduct placebo-controlled trials of preventive interventions, right? Provided that participants give valid consent and provided that the experimental vaccine itself doesn't pose excessive risks through side effects. This view regards the existence of other preventive measures as being irrelevant to the ethics, right? Because it's not trial participation that puts participants at risk of contracting SARS-CoV-2. Okay, so neither of these views I think is correct. The first isn't correct because it is ethical sometimes to ask people to take on risks for the sake of doing research. Asking someone not to take something that would benefit them, I think is no different in this respect from asking someone to take something that might harm them, right? So we ask people to take on risks in research. I think it's fine to do that under certain conditions. The second view is not correct for exactly the same reason, which is asking someone not to take something that would benefit them is like imposing a risk on them. And there are upper limits to the level of risks that it's acceptable to ask people to take on in research. So if a placebo-controlled trial, when we have evidence that another vaccine is safe and effective, is sometimes justified, but it's not always going to be justified, then we want to know what makes it justified. Assume that other standard ethical requirements are met. So assume, we have informed consent and so on. I think we should think about these three elements in particular. First one is we should think about social value. It's only ethical to ask people to take on risks and burdens in research when doing so is going to generate data that can help to benefit others. So in this case, we need to know that the vaccine candidate that's being tested, if effective, has some reasonable prospects are being provided to protect people in the population who wouldn't otherwise be getting protection. And here, in thinking about the social value of current vaccine studies, I think it's really important to look back at the data that Dr. Tomei just provided, looking at potential coverage with the vaccines that we have, and thinking there about whether it's going to be socially valuable, that is important to benefit people outside of a study, to develop and test more vaccines. And I think the answer here is yes. We're not going to have, with the vaccines that have currently gone through phase 3 testing, we're not going to have enough supplies quickly enough and practically enough to vaccinate everyone in the world. The second condition is scientific necessity. It should be the case that the socially valuable information about other vaccine candidates can only be obtained by testing against placebo, not by testing against, for example, the effective vaccine. So it's going to be scientifically necessary to use placebo. And the third element we need to think about is the risks. For any study, the risks of participation should not be excessive, and they should be justified by the social value of the study. Right? So this means risks caused by the research, like side effects of the vaccine, but it also means the risks of foregoing an effective vaccine. If you're asking research participants to forego an effective vaccine, then doing so should be the least risky way of getting to a socially valuable outcome that justifies those risks. So testing further experimental vaccines has got to be socially valuable, it's got to be scientifically necessary to use a placebo control, and the risks shouldn't be excessive. We've got limited time, so I want to make just 3 further points very quickly in the context of these ongoing placebo-controlled COVID-19 vaccine studies. And 2 of these points are about risk, and 1 of them is about social value. First point about risks. In the context of COVID-19 vaccine trials, the risks of foregoing an effective vaccine are going to vary according to context and according to the characteristics of participants. And so in a context where the pandemic is pretty much uncontrolled, as it is in many US states at the moment, the baseline probability of getting infected is high in comparison to places that still have transmission but at a lower rate. For participants who are older or have comorbidities that place them at higher risk, the expected harms, if they do contract SARS-CoV-2, are much higher. So the risks to individual participants are going to vary. In many cases, I think the risk of foregoing a vaccine for an individual is pretty low, but that's not going to be the case for everyone. Second point about risk. There's an open question about when not receiving an effective vaccine constitutes foregoing that vaccine. So for example, given my age, given the fact that I don't have contact with patients, I'm going to be a long way back in the queue for vaccines. I'm not going to be eligible to receive one for many months. So if I enroll in a placebo-controlled trial tomorrow and I receive placebo, in what sense have I been deprived of an effective vaccine? In what sense is it then accurate to say that not receiving the vaccine is a research risk for me? This is a point that I think is worth discussing. Okay, and finally, a point about social value in the context of the multinational vaccine studies that are now being conducted. I think we need to ask the question of who is going to benefit from the results of placebo-controlled trials that are being conducted. If a vaccine trial takes place in Brazil or in Kenya, will the population of Brazil or Kenya get access to the vaccine in the event that it's shown to work? My view is that, at least for research that's being conducted at sites in low and middle income countries, we should expect the results of the research to benefit people in those countries. That is, the social value of the research that justifies doing these placebo-controlled trials should also be local social value. Thanks again for listening. Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joe, for that lucid explanation of the ethics of placebos. Dorcas, over to you.
Okay, really thanks to Joe and Petrus for outlining the field of COVID-19 vaccines that we are currently encountering. I'm coming in with a perspective from Africa, really much more than the other countries. And I talk of Africa, but it's not one homogeneous country. So I recognize there's a lot of differences between and within countries, even as I present this work. I'll quickly touch about the status of COVID vaccines in Africa, and just hint at some of the issues that are raising and that we need to consider when we think of vaccine trials generally, but also when we think of placebo use of placebo control arms in vaccine trials. I think we are all quite familiar with the fact that generally Africa has shown less cases of COVID and mortality, or even extreme cases of COVID than was anticipated when COVID hit the world. And some of those are figures from WHO that show, this is from as of yesterday, the figures from WHO, which was showing the number of confirmed cases globally and the deaths globally. And you looking at the numbers, what you realize is that different sites, report different totals. So there's always a question of what's happening with the reporting. In the African region, again, as you look from the slides, you can also see there are far much less cases and far much less death. And this is the figure that is being shown as of yesterday from Africa CDC dashboard. There is a paper that also looked at the reporting of cases. And one of the issues that have come is, are we really reporting, is Africa really reporting cases? And there's a paper there that shows that what is being reported, what is coming in the health facilities is not always representative of what is happening in the community. That actually there's far much more COVID in the community than is being seen from the health facilities. And the COVID trials, Africa kind of lagged behind a little bit in terms of trials. The first trial was in South Africa in June. And since then, there are still COVID vaccine trials that are going on in Africa. That's a very good website to look at to see on the status of trials that are happening globally, and could focus on African countries to find out how many there are. There are main factors that have affected the uptake of vaccine trials in Africa. Many of them are about socio-political context, how the whole idea of vaccine trials, drug trials, and forever were charged because of media attention and many issues that came out. But also we know that funding in Africa generally for research, and specifically in this COVID, has been not as much, even though many funders are supporting COVID research in Africa. There were also issues to do with the review, how long it was taking to get protocols approved, issues of recruitment for those protocols that have been approved, and underlying all these are all the information, misinformation, rumors that have been circulating about COVID generally and COVID research specifically. There's an initiative that was led by African Union Commission to harness vaccine trials or COVID trials in Africa, and the aim is to secure at least 10 late-stage vaccine trials as early as possible on the continent, and to ensure that there's sufficient data that is being generated on the safety and efficacy of the most promising vaccine candidates for the African population. We have seen increasing number of African countries participating in clinical trials, in vaccine trials, and the media is quite alive with this. WHO website is also talking about it. The WHO African region has been in the forefront in harnessing and bringing together African leaders and member states to talk about COVID, but also specifically to consider the issues of research and of COVID vaccine trials. But the issue of vaccine trials and research is not just about the trial itself, it's also about the context in which this is happening. And when you think about context, you also have to think about, and Joe talked about, the social value, who is going to benefit. We cannot say globally, but how are those benefits going to be distributed over time? And I think I just want to give a gaze or a landscape of what is happening with Africa in as far as vaccine approvals and availabilities are happening. Beatrice has given a very good outline of some of the initiatives that have been led out of Africa to harness vaccines should they become licensed. Some of the key issues that Africa is likely to face and that have been discussed in the in the literature and also in the media is around availability of the vaccines themselves. You're working against a market force that is not very friendly to countries that are not well off. It's a supply demand, and countries able to buy the vaccines are already stockpiling on the vaccines. And that is leaving many countries that do not have the ability to purchase far behind. There are obviously logistical issues and delivery issues, issues of cold chain. If some of the vaccines become available, are licensed for use in Africa, there's a huge problem, a huge question how they can ever be delivered safely, how you don't break the cold chain, issues of prioritization, issues of booster doses, where you have booster doses. We know from immunization data that the moment you start going to third booster dose, fourth second booster doses, and so on, you lose out on attrition. People don't come for the next doses. So that is likely, therefore participation likely to reduce over time. Healthcare systems that are already quite strained, resources and personnel, including even the transportation system and so on. And at community level, I've already talked about the rumors that are going on around COVID, generally about research on COVID, and also the really systemic issues, like men often do not go for immunization programs, and therefore are likely to be low participation when it comes to vaccine availability. And so these are issues that are already being discussed quite widely with bodies in Africa led by Africa CDC, WHO, Afro region, leading in thinking about how we can handle these structural issues that need to be addressed as early as possible. Beatrice has already talked about the funding and the purchase of available vaccines, and this shows what is happening with the countries, the high-income countries already having secured quite a large number of the vaccines that are coming off that are in phase 2, 3. And it shows how that goes down. The line, 9.6 billion doses are already preserved. And you've had like some of the countries have got doses enough to vaccinate their populations 5 times over. There's an initiative that is led by WHO Afro region, UNICEF and others, a partnership between Gavi, the World Health Organization, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness that's called COVAX. And the aim is to establish a mechanism to invest in the development, manufacturing, and procurement of COVID-19 vaccine candidates for countries that sign up to that agreement. And what you see here, the blue shaded are the countries that have signed up to the COVAX agreements. And the orange shaded are the countries that have committed to the COVAX agreement. And well, the green ones or the teal ones are the non-COVAX countries. And what COVAX is doing is it's providing inequality in that in all those countries that have signed up, they are signing up to 20% of the population will be provided with the vaccine once it becomes available. And because they are getting 20% for each country, then that is how it works out on equity. Having said the background, therefore, when it comes to placebo-controlled arm in COVID vaccine trials, some of the issues we need to consider are obviously the contextual issues I've laid out. Those are really important considerations, including where, who is buying, who is purchasing, when are they likely to be available. Even when people think of participating, they're also thinking, how heavy is our burden of vaccine versus other countries? This might not sound like the right place to say it, but that is really important, because if people don't believe that COVID is affecting the community, then they might not see why they need to participate. And in some of the communities, that is the case, especially if they think other things rather than COVID is contributing to mortality and morbidity in the community. There's an issue of general public mistrust towards research generally. And these are historical systemic issues that anyone doing research in Africa and anyone who is dealing with COVID has to face head on. I've talked about having less COVID in Africa, and therefore this is a positive thing, but it feeds into the rumors of potential exploitation, that if we participate, the benefit that comes from the COVID vaccines is not likely to be enjoyed by African populations, but by the other populations. The use of placebo arm, I think, were ethically justified, and Joe has provided a very good justification for that. So that's not an area I would want to go into. just to re-emphasize that as of now, there's a lot of unknowns on the current vaccines, even the ones that have been approved for emergency use, including how it generally works across some of the demographics in the population, how long the immunity lasts, issues of vulnerable populations that have not participated in these trials, including the pregnant women, the real elderly ones, the children, issues of dose regimens, and so on. And then obviously it is very difficult to support use of placebo control arm in a vaccine trial on COVID if there's already a locally available efficacious vaccine. And other research designs could be thought of. Important is to continue building, strengthening, and sustaining trust in research as an enterprise, in the populations where research is happening, and in the populations where research is likely to have an impact. And there are many ways in which this has been discussed and is being promoted, including being really transparent about what is happening with COVID and what the progress is with vaccine trials, issues of fairness in terms of who is selected and which populations are selected to participate, but also where the benefits go to, issues of informed consent, information and processes important, and sustained engagement throughout. Availability of vaccines is a key element in this, as I've already alluded to. I've just given a hint of some of the things that we need to work through anytime we think about research, but more specifically with COVID vaccine trials. And thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas, and thank you, Joe and Beatrice, for excellent presentations that really set the stage for our discussion. I invite participants, if they have questions, to please submit them to the Q&A box. I want to start by asking a question about whether a vaccine receiving a full market licensure as opposed to the emergency use or designation makes a difference in terms of how we think of the justifiability of placebos. Anybody want to tackle that one? Joe, you seem to have thought a lot about placebos, so maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, I'm happy to say something to start. So the case where we have an emergency use authorization is different in a couple of respects. It's different typically in terms of the assessment of the data that's been conducted, but crucially it's different in terms of the amount of data that we're likely to have, right? So as it stands, and as Dr. Tomei pointed out, we're not going to have probably long-term follow-up data. So we're not going to know things like duration of immunity. We're not going to know about maybe some rare or some later side effects. We may not have had as many phase 3 trials as we would normally expect for full licensure of a vaccine. So there's going to be less data and less confidence in the estimates we have about a vaccine on the basis of that data. Now, to me, these are not, there's not some difference in kind here, right? It's not that there's something different about what we know about a vaccine before and after it gets licensure. It's a difference in the degree of confidence that we have and the quantity of evidence that we have for what we conclude about that vaccine. And I think that makes a difference, right? The more confident we are about whether a particular vaccine works, the more questions we're going to want to ask about whether that should be used, for example, as the control, because we know more about it, we're more confident in what a comparison to it would be. And the less need we're going to have to collect more experimental data on that vaccine. But I don't think there's a difference in kind between, you know, before and after licensure. We become increasingly confident that a vaccine works, we become increasingly confident in our estimate of how well it works.
Great, thanks. Beatrice or Dorcas, do you want to add to that?
Sure,
Beatrice?
Ross, I can chime in, yeah. So I agree with Joe. I think, I guess the biggest difference is how much better you know that that product. so I think, and I think this is inherently a great difference, but I would just say that I think some conditions may still apply. You know, we might, if we take the two top candidates, you know, as Dorcas rightly put, it's really hard to imagine how they're going to be deployed in, you know, hard to reach populations. It's as we know, they need to be, at least for most part, in very cold temperatures. That's really difficult to think about delivering them in many settings that I know. So it might be still justifiable, maybe still, if you have a registered vaccine, to continue doing research in order for the social value of the research itself. I think to me the limits, the limit that we need to draw there is that when we do have an efficacious vaccine, whether through emergency use, whether a registered vaccine for my peer, then I think it's really hard to offer a participant with the same characteristics as the peer who have access outside of the context of a clinical trial, to have this person something other than of a vaccine, either through emergency use or license. So I guess Joe used his example as, and I guess this really, you know, it helps us draw the picture. If Joe is not eligible to receive a vaccine now, regardless if it's through emergency use or registered, then it's probably fine to continue considering him as a placebo control in a trial. But at the moment, as his peer is eligible for a vaccine in whichever context, I think this is when it's unacceptable.
Thanks, Beatrice. Dorcas, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think they have done a pretty good job now.
Great. So one of the questions that's been raised by participants, and also sort of in the pre-submission package of questions, is should trial participants be unblinded? One of the manufacturers has said that on the strength of the data, they feel a moral obligation to unblind the participants and offer up all participants the vaccine. This raises certain issues because quite clearly participants may not necessarily fall within the prioritization scheme that governments are putting together to roll out the vaccine in its first phase. Any thoughts about that particular issue? And if there is a moral obligation on behalf of sponsors and pharmaceutical companies, what would ground that moral obligation? My sense is that they like in many contexts, people like to state in clear language, bold language, we have an ethical or a moral obligation without actually explaining the basis upon which that obligation would rest. Anybody want to tackle that one? There's a few questions there.
I'm happy to make a start. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's a question that's come up in other research contexts quite a lot. The way that you framed it, Ross, I think points to one of the differences to those other research contexts. So we have the situation where we've run the vaccine study. Let's assume that we've run the study to the point where we've reached the study's endpoints, right? This is not a question about prematurely unblinding participants and offering them the vaccine. We've completed the study. And the question is, do participants who receive placebo get some sort of priority for receiving the vaccine? Now, to me, we want to ask a couple of questions. One of them is, has the study put them at higher risk for COVID-19? Right? So if being in the study has put them at higher risk of infection, we might think there's some obligation to provide them with greater protection later. If they would have been otherwise eligible for the vaccine, in the way that Dr. Tomei was just mentioning, right? And so being in the study has meant depriving them of a vaccine they could have received, right? Then we might think that they've been at higher risk. And in that case, I can see an argument for why you would unblind participants and give those in the placebo arm a vaccine. if they wouldn't otherwise have gotten the vaccine and they've not been put at higher risk, then I'm not seeing a strong argument in favor of giving them the vaccine. And the reason here, and the reason why it's different than other cases is because we're going to be in conditions of scarcity in terms of the amount of vaccine that we have available, at least early on. And so if a vaccine is provided to someone from the placebo arm who would not otherwise have been, someone like me who would otherwise not have been close to the front in the queue, that means that someone else who would have been further up in the queue is not getting that vaccine, right? And I think that's a much harder argument to make than the case we typically imagine, which is a company running a trial where they have substantial quantities of say, a drug. And the question is, should they provide that drug, or should they provide a vaccine that they have plentiful supplies of to participants after the trial is done? And there, I think we find it much easier to say, yes, they have that obligation, because we're not thinking in terms of if they give the drug to the participants, someone else is being deprived of the drug, or someone else is being deprived of the vaccine. But that would be the case here. So I think it's a harder justificatory hurdle. I suspect others may disagree with me on that, so maybe they can weigh in.
Dorcas or Beatrice, do you want to respond? Dorcas, go ahead, please.
Can I just add, not because I'm necessarily challenging what Joe has said, but I'm also adding another element to it. And I'm thinking about it in terms of the ones who are participating in research are putting themselves first in line for the sake of the society. And I think that provides an argument to say, well, you put yourself for the sake of everybody else. You bore the risks of something that was being trialed where you probably knew very little about it. Does the society also owe you something in return, something to recognize? Obviously, that's not how you will talk to them in research when you are consenting them, because you don't know whether the vaccine will be shown to be efficacious at that point. It's not an obligation at that point, but I think it's more of a moral responsibility to want to do something to the people who put themselves in line to get something for everybody else. And how does that then compare with people who are in the front line of providing care and therefore are more exposed? I think that would be a very tricky balance. I will see there are contexts where you would say, yes, let's put the frontline workers in the forefront of receiving an efficacious vaccine. But when it comes to the next of line, those who participated in the research and probably received the placebo should also be considered alongside that group. That would be my take.
Maybe, can I chime in?
Beatrice, yes, absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think aligned with Dorcas, I guess what you're just describing is reciprocity, right? What we owe to participants that take the extra risk in a trial. I think a couple of thoughts come to my mind. I guess reciprocity here, when we have limited data, is a weaker of an argument as in other cases, I think. So it's not that we may be neglecting something of this participant that's indisputable. Perhaps this is what is it exactly that we're either providing them if we decide to unblind and vaccinate or not. So I guess it is a weaker argument when all of this has been so fast and we have efficacy based on a very small number of cases if you think about it. So if you look at the stats, it's a little scary. So I guess the reciprocity, may be a weaker argument. Now, the risk balance that you just described, I guess, whether if this participant is a healthcare worker or an elder, I think it will be difficult not to have this person, unblind and then be offered a vaccine either, within the trial or a vaccine that's being provided elsewhere. I think to me that is a no-brainer, really. But whether you have an 18-year-old participant in a trial, okay, he's taken the risk. Should this person be receiving the vaccine before his dad, who's at home, who's 75? Maybe not. And then I want to come back to the sacred process of informed consent. What has this person agreed to at the and it may be not a one-time consent, like have the investigators made made sure this person, one, agreed to participate in this endeavor, and which were the conditions, which were the responsibilities of the sponsor towards this participant. How has this evolved with the evolving science? How has these changes been communicated back to the participant so that he remains on board or not? I guess we need to be discussing that more in depth as well. It is really like a marriage that you take on when you sign an informed consent, and it should be seen as this. And I guess you touched upon this, Dorcas, of trustworthiness, really, and how this communication evolves as trial evolves and science around evolves. I guess we really need to discuss that.
Thanks, Beatrice. Well, the questions are coming in fast and furious, and they are excellent questions indeed. So this is obviously a topic of great salience and interest to this group. One of the issues that's been raised by several participants is the notion of how challenge studies may play out now. Would they be an acceptable alternative to placebo-controlled trials for the evaluation of other candidate vaccines, and by extension, other surrogate markers like, say, correlates of immunity if we get a strong signal from the data of the current trials? Who would like to address the human challenge study question? We already had a seminar on that, but this is a little bit more pointed with respect to the methodology of future trials going forward. Beatrice?
I can start, Ross. Yeah, I think there's social value in taking on human challenge studies, and I think they might help to fill in these gaps of data that we can't get to once we have trials that are controlled with other vaccines. So I guess researchers will need to be, like, 2021 will be a challenge for vaccine developers, because they will really need to be creative as we move forward, really. And then I guess human challenge studies do have a place and a part to play in this, and other vaccine trial methodologies, such as Dorcas mentioned, crossover trials, stepped wedge design. So I guess it will be really hard for vaccine developers. And I guess I don't think we can take out of the scenario human challenge studies, in particular because, of course, they'll be very controlled. They'll be enrolling low risk participants, and as much as the more we know about how to deal with infection itself, I guess they will become safer as well. When we sort of feel better about conducting them, and I think there will be a reality. I can totally see that happening.
Can I ask?
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up a little on that. I can't see that challenge studies could replace a phase 3 study at the moment. Is that right, Dr. Tomei? In terms of what we would be able to learn, particularly about the groups that are most at risk of severe disease, who we're not going to be enrolling in challenge studies.
Yeah, so it's not really about replacing.
Yeah.
I think it's an additional, it's an additional resource. For example, challenge studies provide you with information that some phase 3 trials can't provide you with. For example, protection from infection. Depending on design of the trial, most of the trials that we see results for are for protecting from symptomatic disease, right? So, for example, if it informs us better of a particular candidates that protect from infection itself, it may have a role in informing more about how to stop or to slow down transmission, for example. So I think it's additional information that it can provide, not necessarily replace, and not now. I guess for now, I guess we'll all agree that phase 3 trials and placebo-controlled remain to be, the best source of evidence for us for now. But I think moving forward, I guess we can't take challenge studies out of the potential methodologies for us to get more evidence.
Thanks. Dorcas, do you want to add in?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about how the conversation and thinking about challenge studies is changing as we know more about COVID and as therapies, become available. I think the starting point would be, why would somebody want to conduct a challenge study, and why would that be seen as the right design for the question that they want to ask? I ask that because I think we now have better understanding of COVID than we had before. I think before there probably was a stronger argument when everybody was trying to understand how does the virus operate, how does it cause, and how does it behave in the body, and wanted to learn that more closely. But having said that, I'm not saying there would be no justification for challenge study, but I think there need to be a careful consideration. The other one is challenge studies. If there's no, I know you're getting vaccines, but vaccines are to prevent you from getting COVID. As of now, I don't know what treatment, and I could be, this is not my field of expertise, what treatment one would give to somebody who has got COVID to cure them. So when you when you infect people so that they develop the COVID, so that you can learn through a challenge model, then how are you going to prevent more advance or more harm to the people? How are you going to cure them? Where will you stop? I think those, I don't have answers for those, but those are the really things that need to be considered, because you really don't want to be causing more COVID in people. You want to make sure that you control that. So if there is no effective therapy now for people get sick with COVID, then how will a challenge model work? One way is obviously not to give them with something that does not cause the COVID, which is fine. But then how else are you going to learn about some of the areas that you might be interested in? I raise those because I think for me, those become very important if you have something that can really cure whatever reaction people get out of what you're infecting them with. And secondly, what else in extra are you learning that we cannot learn from the data that has been generated so far, and where we are with all the information and all the trials that are currently on?
Thanks, Dorcas. So I'm going to shift our reflection now to the issue of social value. And a question that has been posed is, what are the conditions to determine whether any additional vaccine has sufficient social value to justify a placebo? The question reads, we may have 3 or 4 effective vaccines and may need another 5 or 10. However, vaccine 11 may not add enough social value to justify placebo control trials. Is the understanding of social value purely contextual or related to a particular area where a clinical trial may be proposed to be conducted with a placebo, or are there some general features of social value that might help us out here? And I believe the question was directed to you, Joe, but I'm sure Dorcas and Beatrice will have illuminating things to say as well. So why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks for that question. I think we can unpack social value a little bit here, right? And we could say, what is social value? Well, social value is the anticipated benefits to future patients from, or future individuals who will be protected from disease in the event of a vaccine being successful. Or if you want to view it more expansively, it's the value of the knowledge that is generated by a trial, where that might be either that we learn enough about a vaccine to be confident that it could be provided and therefore benefit people, or we learn enough to not proceed with the development of a vaccine and thereby accelerate the process of deciding among the vaccine candidates we have. But if it's about the benefits to future patients or future individuals who could be protected from disease, that suggests that we're going to reach a limit point, right? And the limit point is when there's no reasonable prospect that the vaccine, the experimental vaccine that's being tested, is going to lead to any greater benefit to patients or individuals at risk than what is currently anticipated. And it's going to be a point where it's unclear, right? It's going to be a point where you could speculate that maybe there will, maybe there won't be benefit, but you're going to get diminishing returns over time. And at some point, I think you're going to be able to make the judgment. It's highly unlikely that this is going to be providing any additional benefit. And that's going to be a limit point to saying whether there is any social value at all. And one other quick thing, that point about social value, right? About social value being expected benefits to future individuals at risk or future patients. That's independent of the other conditions for a placebo-controlled trial being justifiable. That's just a condition for research being justifiable, right? Whereas, of course, we will still want to know, is it scientifically necessary to use placebo? Are the risks justified by the amount of social value and so on?
Thanks. Beatrice or Dorcas, do you want to add anything?
Sure, Ross. And I think the way Joe put it, I think it's really interesting. So there's, I guess, while we don't have, for example, while we don't have a perfect vaccine, and history has shown us that these first to be developed not always will be, you know, the best vaccines for a given pathogen. The current, as practical examples, the current vaccines that we have are two-dose schedule. Dorcas has pointed out as being an issue, and preliminary data from at least a few that I've seen have very low protection after the first dose, at least for some of these vaccines. So it is an issue. So I guess and like we discussed in the beginning, how you can the cold chain issues around the top candidates now remain to be a challenge. So I guess we have more than enough reasons to continue research, right? Not to speak of not special, but populations that have not yet been included in trials, such as pregnant women, children. We're not even talking about them. So I guess there's no, it's an easy answer to say we need further research, right? We need to keep enrolling people in different populations to try for better vaccines and easier and vaccines that are easier to be deployed. Now, not all of these will be valid to continue with placebo trials, and I guess again, as much further we go into research, we're probably going to lose this advantage of still keeping the placebo trials the most. So 6 months from now, we'll probably be having a totally different conversation, mostly because we'll have more vaccine accessible to populations. So it will be hard to continue to keep people on placebo-controlled trials. But I guess overall, if you want to think scientifically, there remains to, there are questions to be answered that are much better answered if you do have a placebo-controlled group and that you follow over time. And I think this is hard to argue against. So as long as these people that we keep on trials, that we keep unvaccinated, are the ones at lower risk for acquiring disease or acquiring disease and developing severe disease, and as long as these people wouldn't, they're far from receiving, having access to receive the vaccine, I think it will still be acceptable, ethically acceptable.
Dorcas, did you want to add anything to this?
I'm agree with what Beatrice and Joe has said. I was considering the really important thing of cold chain. We have two Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. We know that deploying those vaccines, for example, in Africa, is going to be a real challenge because of just maintaining the cold chain. So we want to get a vaccine that will be right for the context. And the right is not just in terms of efficacy, it's about how it can be distributed, how it can, it can be delivered, how it can be given. And I think that makes some kind of justification for continued research, even when we have an efficacious vaccine, which can be deployed elsewhere, but it's not locally available. I think I'm just re-emphasizing that point.
Great, thank you. So even if, let's say, we decide not to go forward with or continue with placebo-controlled trials, there will be still research done on vaccines. So even if we envision non-inferiority designs, there's a large number of questions about research and vaccine research that have been raised by our participants. Some of the questions relate to the issue of building trust and engaging with communities, and speaking to some of the special issues of recruiting candidates in low and middle income countries. So 3 issues there: recruitment into trials of any stripe, building and working on community engagement, and ensuring trust in the process. Dorcas, I'm going to go to you first for this, if you don't mind.
Thanks. I think, Rose, you raise issues that we are all grappling with, partly because I think the way in which trials in Africa was introduced or came to be discussed already set not a very good precedence for any COVID research in Africa. It came up with a lot of media attention on potential for exploitation. And when you've got, really trusted gatekeepers in the countries talking about these things, then they affect how the population sees about COVID, but any research about COVID. And therefore, I think engagement, we often talk about as community engagement, but we really need to think about the political, what I call the policymakers, the shapers, the one who set the ground for what needs to happen in country. And I know these changes varies country to country, region to region, but there's a very strong, if you've got buy-in from governments, and in my presentation, I talked about some of those mechanisms in which buy-in is happening in Africa. If you've got those buy-in, there's issues of solidarity. States are making decisions as a block on what is going to happen in their region. Those are mechanisms that need to be carefully considered because they're making decisions on what is happening with vaccines and with any products that come from there. And that is a group that is often neglected in research, but I think it has become a really core component in our engagement work. So that's about we need to think. The review and the regulatory systems are very powerful forces in our countries. They are trusted by the communities as the bodies that look for their interests. If we are not engaging with them and we only engage with them at the point of protocol approvals, then I think the communication needs to be strengthened. At the point where there's a lot of uncertainties about what is going on, they become the bodies in which people are relying on to approve protocols that are really considering contextual issues. The community becomes an important, of course, throughout is an important part, and I talk about how engagement needs to happen throughout. But we are also recognizing that with COVID, it has challenged the mechanisms by which we engage with the communities. And that challenge is how we build trust. When we use traditional systems, our own traditional systems with interaction, those are now not possible. Then we've got to be very creative on how we continue engaging our communities, not simply abandoning them. Trust, I think, is part of the engagement process, but also really being faithful and true to what you present to the people that you're involving with. It's always clear that PIs need to get back to participants and give information transparently as any time that new information is coming up. And participants will hold you to account if that doesn't happen. If an efficacious vaccine comes up and that is not being communicated back to participants, they are picking it. We are in the social media. People are picking all kinds of information. And I think we need to be careful that we do not water down the trust that we are building in the processes that we are doing. So sorry for a long statement, but I think it's really important to think about engagement across board, not just with the communities, but everybody is involved in this enterprise. And I think we need to sustain our trust building relationships.
Yeah, thank you. Beatrice, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, hard to add to what Dorcas just so beautifully put, but just to say that there are resources, right? I guess we all agree that community engagement is in the core of response, and sometimes even against our leaders, our government leaders, right? So I'm speaking from my home country. we have seen a government that has been non-supportive throughout the response and research endeavors, and we have seen the community really arise with their own alternatives, with their own responses, which is really beautiful to see. And just to say that, as you're saying, Dorcas, how we engage communities now will really impact how these same communities will accept or not vaccines in just a couple of months, right? So if we don't do this now, this is the real time that we have to really engage in trustful relationships with the communities if we want to have them, really engage in response. And then this will again impact how they will take vaccine. And then community can be very different, right? So at least in Brazil, the first trials were focusing on healthcare workers, and perhaps the acceptance was easier because, of course, they were frontline people that were bearing the greatest risk of disease and death. But when we move forward to the general population, the issues will be different. So the community that we need to engage to is different. The communication needs to be tailored so that we really have people's buy-in and participation. So not only buy-in, right? So really participation in the decision-making of how things are done, really.
Thank you. Joe, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think my fellow panelists did an excellent job, and both have expertise here that I lack.
Thank you. Well, we're getting close to time, and I'm going to make a proposal to FEPRIN. This has been such a great panel, and the speakers have been so insightful and illuminating. And obviously, many of the questions that we have around the vaccinations, the vaccines, the trials, and the research are yet to be answered, and it's a narrative that's going to continue into 2021. So we might want to meet back with the same group in 6 months and reflect back on what we've learned in the interim. But before we can conclude, I want to offer up to each of the panelists an opportunity to make any observations or comments that they've been wanting to make, to maybe get out their crystal ball and prognosticate a little bit to set up our discussion in 6 months' time. And I'll go in reverse order from where we started, which means I'm going to ask Dorcas to go first, and then Joe, and then Beatrice. Dorcas, any final last words? Or I would say interim words. This is interim ethical analysis, yes.
Thank you very much. I think it's the topic for discussion is really illuminating. Like you said, it's something that I would like to revisit when we know much more and when we see what is evolving. Often Africa is seen as lagging behind in research. I think we are changing that landscape. There's a lot of researchers who can do groundbreaking research, and I'm excited to be participating in these kind of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas. Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think one of the things that will be interesting to see in 6 months' time is whether this is the pressing issue or not. And to me, it seems one of the really important effects of having these sorts of discussions about the ethics of trial design is not merely to get the ethics of trial design right in a vacuum, but because of what effects that has down the road on the trust that people have in research that's ongoing, but research that's been done and has resulted in products. So I think this sort of discussion matters. In the long run, it may matter most because it shows good faith in trying to treat people right. And that good faith then leads down the road to trust in vaccines that are developed and are being offered to populations who are at risk of infection. So I too will be very interested to see what we're talking about in 6 months' time and how this is related to it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Beatrice, you get the last word before we sign off.
Well, that's hard, but I guess if I can make my wish for 6 months, I would like to see more transparency in every level. So, starting from the research trials themselves, and transparency between developers, researchers, and participants, and community advisory boards, but up to the level of the researchers writing articles. I would like to see many more peer-reviewed articles for us to really see the data and the tables and the figures, rather than having, you know, the information on your cell phone through press releases. So I guess transparency is something that will be key as we move forward with the research agenda. And thanks, Ross, for being this wonderful chair, as usual.
Thank you, Beatrice. You're very kind. So it's time to wrap up. This has really been a terrific discussion. And Dorcas, Joe, and Beatrice, I'm exceptionally grateful to you for taking time and being so responsive to the questions and so insightful, really bringing your experience and expertise to bear. Thank you to all the participants for taking time out of their busy day to join us. This is the last of the FEPRIN 2020 webinars. We'll be starting up again in 2021. And of course, we'll be back in 6 months with the same panel to look at vaccine progress. This has been recorded and will be up on the FEPRIN website soon. And we'll try to get to all of the questions that have been asked. So in closing, may I wish you all the best. May I wish you to take good care of yourselves and each other, to have a safe and relaxing holiday season for those of you who are going into the Christmas holidays, to wish you a happy new year. And thank you once again for participating with us today, and we will see you in the new year. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.